All right, well let's turn our attention to Ezequiel Di Paolo's
Mhm.
wonderful paper in the Journal of Consciousness Studies a couple of years ago, uh, titled "Facts" or F/Acts: Ways of Enactive World Making. And it seems like it's mostly an attempt to carry forward Francisco Varela's so-called enactive paradigm or program or stance, as you would like to call ontogenesis. And I found it to be really speaking to a lot of the issues I have had with how an activism
Yeah,
sometimes gets framed as more of an
yeah,
epistemological stance, and what is the ontology of
yeah,
this
yeah.
approach? And Ezekiel goes right for that question in ways, and he's citing Gilbert Simondon and Alfred North Whitehead, and so it's right in our wheelhouse.
Yeah, yeah.
Definitely going to be touching on so many of the questions we've been raising. And directly addressing some of your concerns, maybe we'll see about autopoiesis and how that gets framed in terms of operational closure
Mhm.
and so on. I think his understanding of how agents and worlds engage each other in these different ways. He names three: interaction, transaction, and uh, what was the third one? Um,
Constitution.
constitution. Yeah,
Yeah,
might start to unravel some of those issues a little bit. But I've taken some notes. I guess we could, if it's seems like a good approach to you, just kind of go through it uh,
yeah.
page by
This,
page. And
yeah. I mean, as usual, as I've said to you already offline, I read this paper before Christmas, 6 weeks ago, and really enjoyed it. And certainly annotated it quite a bit, but I was like frantically this morning trying to transcribe some of my annotations and stuff. And so I'll be relying a little bit on you to be our steersman as usual, because I assume you have slightly better notes than I would have. And some of my memory of the paper is necessarily a bit vague at this point. I also read several of the things that Ezekiel had recommended to us about kind of in terms of directions in enactivism in the email exchange that we had with him. So I read several, very short pieces from the book on autonomy, which is really quite worthwhile checking out as well. I mean, they were short pieces and necessarily couldn't address too many things, but I think there's a lot of movement in the directions that I would like to see things moving in, I suppose. And obviously, I haven't had or claim to have had incredibly deep familiarity with the enactivist literature, but I think we've had similar concerns when we have engaged with it, that there are certain, shortcomings that we perceive, perhaps. And I think whilst this paper begins very clearly with a signaling of the inheritance from Varela, the inspiration that Varela has provided to this way of thinking, I do think it also forms very much, and I think this is consistent with the exchange we had with Ezekiel, a kind of internal critique of that lineage, and where some of the earlier conceptual innovations uh, were not able to fulfill the promise of the movement. And so certainly things like certain notions of closure, as well as the potentially, limited epistemic framing. Not that that's necessarily Varela's framing, but yeah, I think it's what's been really interesting, both in that engagement with Ezekiel and reading this recently, is that sense of the kind of evolution, if you want, or the development of the lineage of thinking coming out of autopoiesis into an activism, and why, Ezekiel's been clear to distinguish autopoiesis from an activism, and that very much a lot of the critiques that you and I have shared of some of that milieu are being addressed internally, the direction of travel there is very consistent with the ways in which we would probably have liked to have seen it go. And I think it'd be very interesting now. I mean, it's a huge project, and I mean, just doing justice to this paper is a huge project in and of itself, really. But to refer back onto, the original or early writings on autopoiesis and some of the ambition that those writings have, including to like replace Darwin. This is obviously going to be an axe I'm always going to grind, but to replace Darwinism as a fundamental paradigm for biology and all of that. And I'm not sure Ezekiel would see it this way because, most people think of Darwinism in terms of sort of neo-Darwinian conceptions and whatever. But I think in many ways,
Adaptationism and that,
yeah,
yeah.
exactly. I think in many ways, what's being achieved in work like this paper is a kind of reparation with that evolutionary view and a kind of what you get when you generalize the Darwinian principles, and again, not in a restrictive manner in the way that neo-Darwinism does, or in a regressive manner, but when you really generalize them, is actually pretty similar to what's happening, in my opinion, as sort of we're seeing this development of enactivism and its sort of attempts to fulfill that early promise.
Yeah, yeah. I'm seeing a parallel here in how you're trying to go back to Darwin. I think let's go back and read Darwin actually and sort of get underneath all of the sedimentation of various interpretations that strayed from what was truly novel in his thinking, neo-Darwinism and adaptationism and these various forms of reductionism that latched onto one little part of what he was saying, perhaps, and then mixed it in with Mendel and Weissman, and his original insight gets lost. I think I have a similar thing with Plato. When I hear Platonism and people attacking Platonism, I'm like, wait a minute, that's not my Plato.
Yeah, no, I think definitely it's like, Platonism is not Plato, as we've said, and Darwinism is not Darwin. And I think you would probably agree. I'd hope you would agree. I mean, there's a lot in Darwin's own writing and worldview that obviously I would repudiate.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and I
same
think,
with Plato.
yeah, and I think in both cases, I suppose it behooves us as people who lionize those thinkers to some degree, to recognize those shortcomings, um, and recognize, grapple with the fact that there are a lot of bad readings and a lot of sort of pernicious consequences of extrapolation from Plato or extrapolation from Darwin, and some of those at least. I mean, we've said this about Jung as well. Some of these have to actually fall at the feet of Plato, Darwin, and Jung. Like it's like, what is it about the way these ideas were presented that
Mhm.
made the whatever we think of as the central insight sometimes be a little bit obscured and other aspects be sort of, overemphasized, reified, or whatever it is. And I think, in the case of Darwin, a lot of kind of a little bit of what he was saying, yeah, gets taken up, but a lot of what happens is a reincorporation of that little bit of the insight into a more classical worldview. And of course, that is actually was the case for Darwin. Like most of his worldview was pretty straightforwardly the worldview of a, 19th century English gentleman. Um,
And
and
sociopolitically, you mean, but also in terms of Newtonian physics as the
Well,
background.
yeah, absolutely. Sociopolitically, metaphysically, I mean, both the theism that he, you know, um, maintained at, early on at least, and was, kind of sort of somewhat disabused of by Huxley and others. I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying that's sort of what happened.
Mhm.
Like he didn't think that his writings were in conflict with those religious beliefs. Like he also didn't think his writings were in conflict with Newtonian mechanics.
Mhm.
Or in conflict with some of the, unfortunately insidious but very generic racism of his time and sociocultural context. But in fact, if you read from the principles first, there's deep conflict with all of those things. And
Yeah.
in some sense, a number of people, friends of his, recognized more than anything the conflict with a certain monotheistic conception and a creationist conception, so Huxley and others, but they may also not have recognized sufficiently enough the conflict with the mechanical conception, which, of course, as you and I would agree, has much more in common with that monotheistic conception
Mhm.
than it may superficially appear to have. And they, of course, as other, members of the English gentry or not, if we're talking about people like Wallace, he was not a gentleman. So he had different views, as very different political views. But
and metaphysical views.
and metaphysical views, indeed. Yeah. But yeah, some of the way that, we take a core principle, we decide these are the core principles, and then we extrapolate from those. We kind of see, well, a lot of the other more or less tacit or background
Yeah.
beliefs this thinker had are quite inconsistent with the thrust of their own thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that one of the things that first drew me to Autopoiesis, I first read Varela and Maturana's early work on it, and then I read Evan Thompson's book, Mind and
Mm.
Life, which was published just as I was starting graduate school, and he has a really
2007.
interesting 2007, yeah. Um, I was reading the part where he talks about how Darwin is often misunderstood by lay people as having explained the origin of life or something, but he's explaining the origin of speciation and species and offering a principle to account for speciation, and the problem of, well, what is life and how did it originate is not addressed at all unless you go for some kind of RNA world hypothesis where you really try to push the replicator idea as far as it can go. But the idea of
Mm.
autopoiesis as a condition, it's the typical transcendental kind of argument, a condition for the
Yeah.
possibility of the sort of speciation that Darwin was describing, which makes it more of a rationalist program, right? Um,
Yeah.
I did, and in some ways do find that compelling, but it just leaves you with that framing leaves you with this irresolvable problem of, well, the origin of life. How do you get from neutral
Yeah.
physics and chemistry to the normative horizon of experience and self-production realized by a cell,
Yeah.
all the way up to his last paper in 2002 with Andreas Weber. Varela
Mm.
was insisting on a sharp cut there. Even
Yeah.
though I love this undergraduate statement that Ezequiel Di Paolo starts with in this paper, that as an undergrad, Varela said that he's really interested in the psyche of the universe. Obviously, that hits me. That makes me feel joy inside to know that that's what was motivating him from the time he was a teenager.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about what Evan Thompson says in Mind and Life, which is an amazing book, is that he says that autopoiesis is a precondition of evolution, and I
Yeah,
just think that that's just not understanding what the word evolution means. To be honest, like I completely understand that a lot of people have that very restricted idea of what evolution is, and in some sense, it makes it seem as though Darwin even invented the concept of evolution. But this is not historically or even contemporaneously coextensive with the uses, with the development of that term and the usages of that term. So I think the generalized version of evolution that we see, obviously in a Whitehead or a Peirce or whatever, like in any process philosopher, is actually more. Yes, those people are all working in the wake of Darwin and obviously other 19th century evolutionists and whatever, but it's very consistent with the fact that the word has always had very generic uses, and its importation into biology is a relatively late thing. And then its sort of weird merging and conflation with its originally oppositional thesis of epigenesis, which is what happens in Darwin, because Darwin is an epigenetic thinker in that sense completely, um, is all part and parcel of this history that makes it when we get to 2007 and you're saying, or even 1970, whatever, when the
yeah.
original autopoiesis book is published, like saying that autopoiesis is a precondition of evolution, that's where it becomes like Mysterian for me. So that kind of goes along with and it's basically there. I'm not going to quote, I don't have an eidetic memory, but it's basically there in the original autopoiesis book that this is just a spontaneous origin. It is like this weird autochthonous kind of magical
Yeah.
event. They don't have an account. And I mean, still nobody has it. And of course, it is literally true that Darwin, threw up his hands and, he had his little warm wet
He
pool.
said we may as well ask for the origin of matter.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, he actually thought, in some sense, I guess that this was a metaphysical question,
Mm.
and that this is not the kind of thing that he was humble. He didn't want.
Well, that interesting thing about the last paragraph of Origin, where some
Mm.
editions include, is it that he adds it in the last edition that a creator breathed life into
Oh
one
yeah,
of the
yeah,
original forms?
yeah.
I forget exactly
Yeah, I
which.
can't remember when that was added and subtracted because there's a lot of little but quite substantive differences between editions, including, I always say that the word evolution doesn't appear in the first edition, because he
Right.
didn't, that was not his notion that he was trying
Well,
to,
transformism is probably less loaded in the sense that evolution seems to imply the unrolling of something pre-rolled, and
yeah,
so it can be
yeah, yeah,
misleading.
yeah. I mean, it
Um,
originally, as you know, that was its
yeah,
implication or its direct meaning.
but
Um,
I think that, Evan is his targets in that book were people like Richard Dawkins and Dan
yeah,
Dennett. And I know
totally.
they've
Yeah,
done wonderful work, but I think he was zeroing in on their Darwin, which I think
yeah,
is maybe overlaps a little bit with your Darwin, but I think you're pointing to
yeah.
something distinct
Yeah.
also.
Yeah, I mean, totally. I can absolutely signal certainly my debt as a young, biologist reading like Dawkins and Dennett in my teens and everything, so that they helped shape the way that I think about things, and that they were very, very, very insightful. And Dawkins is a really very good writer. This is the
Hmm.
truth. Like,
Yeah.
and it's just worth saying, but I also have very profound disagreements with them on certain issues, and Dawkins even far more than Dennett, although I have my profound disagreements with Dennett as well. I think he is a more nuanced and expansive thinker than Dawkins, who was brilliant in like the whole memetics thing, and that's a whole other conversation. Like this is like a cool idea. He had these flashes of insight, extended phenotype, obviously. Like there are some really great ideas in Dawkins, and he was able to really lucidly present them. But then, of course, his influence became oversized, even though, again, he was not the originator of the the
Mhm.
kind of what would become, I guess, a neo-Darwinian orthodoxy or a sort of genetic deterministic view. Um, and genes is the privileged level of selection. I mean, he himself would credit George Williams and others as being the ones to say that before he did. But just on like I am starting to get to a point where I'm thinking that evolution is also this word with so much baggage, and so having been reading Simondon a lot for the last couple of years, in one sense evolution and ontogenesis are synonymous concepts, but in another way I start to think like maybe it's maybe not, maybe there might be reasons to restrict the usage of evolution sometimes, not to just biology, obviously, but or actually rather it's the other way around. Evolution is such a generic term that
Mhm.
ontogenesis can be something more specific and more targeted. And so I guess the whole idea with kind of ontogenetic thought or an ontogenetic stance is that, when you see a claim like, autopoiesis is a necessary precondition for evolution or something like that, I immediately want to know, well, okay, so you are, and you said it was like a rationalist way of framing things. You are positing this sort of invariant principle of order that is necessary for this constructive thing to happen on top of it. And I immediately just want to say, what are the conditions of genesis of that principle of that,
Mhm.
organize that form or whatever it is, and that's just like we were saying in the discussion with the Levin group yesterday. It's like I'm not saying, that we're always going to be able to tell that story in any convincing way. I'm just saying it's always a question that's available to ask, and sometimes we hit upon insoluble problems, and we're like this something here seems very very arbitrary, and we can't get beyond it. We can't understand its conditions of origin or genesis. And that has surprising downstream consequences because it canalizes all the thought downstream of it in some way. So we lose certain degrees of freedom. What happens if we actually do try to deconstruct that and get behind it and understand how that, and of course, in this case, this is the origins of life question, but
Mhm.
try to understand how that thing emerged,
Right.
and not just take it as given as something that enabled the other thing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's well said. Yeah. So, okay, let's dig in a little bit more in this paper here. I just wanted to signal still on the first page where he talks about how, you know, Varela's vision following on from I'm interested in the psyche of the universe comment. He says Varela's vision spreads beyond science into concerns for the human condition in all its messiness and difficulties, as well as the condition of the planet within which we grow. These are ethical, practical, and philosophical concerns. And the background here that I think is interesting and relevant is the Lindisfarne Association that Evan Thompson's father, William Irwin Thompson, organized that Varela contributed to, and uh, Gregory Bateson was there, Lynn Margulis was there, other luminaries would come through, and they would. There's some great books that came out of that. I think Gaia 1 and Gaia 2 are two volumes that are probably out of print at this point, where Lovelock and Margulis and Varela, they're all writing about these larger applications of the scientific work that they're doing and how they apply to the human condition and so on. And it struck me that William Irwin Thompson had this great term that he came up with that sort of builds on the German terms that in English, we talk about natural science and the humanities, in German, Naturwissenschaft and Geistwissenschaft. Geistwissenschaft would literally translate as spiritual science, but we say the humanities. Thompson came up, the elder Thompson came up with this term Wissenkunst, Kunst meaning art in German. So it's like science hyphen art, to sort of signal the need to overcome the disciplinary
Yeah.
boundary there. And I see
Yeah.
so much of, Varela's work on enactivism, and the sort of laying down a path and walking and the intrinsically poetic nature of this, that it's an attempt to
Mhm.
bridge our experience of life as human beings, where we're always bound up in these processes of meaning making, and to try to locate that in an account of life as such that would allow
Mhm.
us to feel the continuity between ourselves as human beings and the larger living world to which we belong. And that always struck me as an extremely valuable and important counter discourse. I think that's the word
Yeah.
Ezekiel uses, because the mainstream has been mechanistic and dualistic despite its claims to be physicalist, in
Yeah.
the sense that the human gets put over in a special category and the rest of nature is described in a certain way. I mean, in
Yeah.
some scientists are more consistent in applying the sort of mechanistic reductionism that they view nature through to the human, which gets scary. But Dawkins, for example, doesn't want to do that.
No.
But then he ends up with a kind of incoherent position, I would say, at the end of the day, that
Yeah.
only the human can rebel against our selfish genes.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I would just signal that also plenty of scientists are not, mechanicists or proponents of the mechanical philosophy in general, and maybe, you know, don't have real a metaphysical position. I think sometimes we look at these, massively influential popularizers of science,
mhm.
um, and generalizers, and we were talking about this yesterday, particularly following the comments made by Lauren Ross, the way that we go from, methodological principles, and this is how I can ask a certain kind of question about things. This is a way I can perhaps gain knowledge about a certain kind of system, to, a very different discourse where we're saying this is the nature of reality, and we're often creeping, you know, without really knowing we're doing it ourselves from one to the other. And that's particularly what we find in a lot of these big narrativized popularizations of science coming from scientists.
Yeah,
Uh, and that has had this incredible influence on the popular, understand the development of what might be called scientism or whatever, but the popular understanding of like what science says about the nature of reality. But
yeah,
just to say, there are plenty of practicing scientists who just don't
for
indulge
sure.
in that kind of
For
thing.
sure. But I think as an example, I mean, there are philosophers like Daniel Dennett, who we've mentioned, who is brilliant, and I love reading his stuff, and I should reread his stuff.
Yeah.
Darwin's Dangerous Idea was uh, I was probably 20 years old when I first read that.
Mhm.
And it just, I felt so, I was supercharged, mostly disagreements, but just supercharged to like, I had to find where he was wrong about
Yeah.
some of the major claims. And I don't know that I've succeeded in doing that for all of them, but there's a claim, actually, I came across this in another paper we'll discuss next month, with Darius Parvizi Wayne,
Mm.
um, where at this second page he quotes, it's not a quote of Darwin, it's sort of a gloss, sorry, of Dennett. It's a gloss on something that Dennett claims, where he says the challenge for the cognitive scientist is to provide a subpersonal explanation of agent level abilities. uh,
Mm.
in other words, what I read there is a subpersonal explanation for personhood. And
Mm.
even if that's just, you know, I think Dennett was a wonderful man and very moral person, I'm sure. But it strikes me as as a statement like that, that you could even hope to find, or that the goal of science is to provide a subpersonal explanation for personhood. To me, that's ass backwards. You can't, that's greedy reductionism in his own terms, I would say. You could provide a description in terms of subpersonal processes that could be really important and useful, but that's the slippage that I think you're speaking to, and even the best sometimes slide into that. And I think Varela's whole project was an attempt, he would say we have a virtual self and he's Buddhist, so his conception of personhood might be different from mine, but phenomenology was irreducible for him. And
Yeah.
science takes place within that phenomenological horizon and can't explain, experience away by reference to something
Yeah.
sub-phenomenal, right?
Yeah, and I would completely agree with that. And that's would be an appeal to the prosaic
Mm. Yeah.
in my
Yeah,
sense.
it's like the manifest image and the scientific
Yeah.
image, like how do they relate, right?
Yeah, and I always remember Jay Garfield saying that the manifest that Sellers believed. I mean, he's attributing this to a conversation he had with Wilfred Sellers. This was at a seminar that I went to with Jay, um, saying that the scientific image is a peninsular offshoot of the manifest image. But
Hmm.
I think it's also really important, and this is where and Ezekiel speaks to this directly as to why enactivism is not idealism, and but
Hmm.
is also not phenomenology.
Hmm.
It has a phenomenological aspect to it, but I think we want to be careful because we do make infer in science in particular. We always make inferences that go beyond, in some sense. They are contingent upon that prosaic or firstness, that direct experience of things, but they go beyond that, and sometimes that makes novel experiences possible. But there are lots of things that we have very good reason to believe are existence in some sense that don't actually seem to impinge directly on our experience. And that's also important. And that's why for me, I've got the prosaic, the inquired, and the speculative, right?
Hmm.
So I've got these different ways of engaging with the world, and they have sort of slightly different rules associated with
Yeah.
them. And
Yeah.
then,
I mean,
yeah,
we want science and speculative philosophy to provide ways of um, challenging our common sense
yeah.
self-understanding, of course, right?
Yeah, we don't want them to just collapse back into, even though they are contingent upon that world of primary prosaic experience. They are
Hmm.
not the same mode of relating to the world that you could
Right.
talk about them in terms of different kinds of extrapolation
Hmm.
from.
Yeah.
But then they feed back on and
Yeah.
change that, which I think is very consistent with what Ezekiel is saying. But I don't think it's quite so easy to dismiss as he does some of the charges that Autopoiesis in particular, and maybe enactivism increasingly less, but are idealistic in some important sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So well, let's turn to that. Let's turn to that discussion of, how he's trying to avoid naive realism and constructivism, and
Oh yeah.
he quotes Varela as saying, "No, I'm not a realist," as if he doesn't even have to really go into why. It's just obviously I'm not a realist. But then he says, "I'm also not a constructivist,"
Hmm.
because that makes it seem like it's just the organism or the person is just projecting onto a blank slate or something, and he's clearly denying that. And you know, Ezekiel gets into pluralism and Goodman and world making, and he mentions Richard Rorty, and I I think it's important. I would want to affirm a kind of ontological pluralism here, and that it's not that there is a world out there and then many perspectives on the world, but in some sense, it's perspectives on perspectives all the way down. And we have to update our epistemology to and not to give up the possibility of objectivity, but recognize that objectivity is um, the achievement of certain communities of inquiry, and that there's a certain ethics underlying it, and a cultivation of a certain kind of attention, and often the development of all sorts of technological instruments, to achieve objectivity,
And
rather than. Mhm.
Just to quickly insert this, it's always relational, right? The object
Oh
is
yeah.
always correlative to something, not necessarily to a subject in the sort of human sense. It's not a Kantian affirmation of the subject-object necessary duality, but it is a relational thing. I think we'll get into that more when we discuss some of the ontology, like the constitutive ontology that Ezekiel mentions. But sorry, yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Keep going.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to get into a critique of Rorty here a little bit because he throws Rorty in there with Goodman and Putnam and wants to show how enactivism does have some resonance with pragmatism, and I prefer the old pragmatism, like the
Mm,
OG pragmatism, Person and James and Dewey to Rorty certainly. But Rorty's great to read, and but
mm,
he had this panel discussion at Stanford. I think it was in 2007 or so. I wasn't at it, but I heard a recording where he was in dialogue with Isabel Stengers and
mm,
Donna Haraway, and they were talking about Whitehead. Um, and Rorty was at his most ironic and pedantic, and was basically in a Wittgensteinian way saying that, you know, uh, we can't refer to a language independent reality. We're kind of
mm,
caged in, and it was very much a kind of linguistic idealism, where there are just different ways of talking, and artists talk in this way, and scientists talk in that way, and theologians talk in this way, and there's no way to get beyond those particular modes of discourse to something independent. And and then you have Stengers and Donna Haraway trying to say, no, oysters have propositional feelings, drawing on Whitehead. And it's like it's a really entertaining but frustrating conversation from my point of
yeah.
view. I'll link to it in the description. And so I just felt like, what Goodman is doing and what ontological pluralism would be about is totally different from Rorty's pragmatism. I think it's much more like Peirce's
Mm,
pragmatism there. Um,
yeah. Well, and I think if I could find the quotes that I think Di Paolo would be in agreement with what you're saying there.
mhm.
And there's this discussion of a description independent reality, but then and the claim that we can't have that. But then, of course, Di Paolo asks the question, where do descriptions come from? And we would just say, and I think this is consistent with what Ezekiel is saying, description is a particular mode of relation. It's a representational mode of relation, indeed. Um, and so, we can't speak of relation independent realities, but descriptions are just a very specific and very narrative form of relation in a certain sense, right? And where do they come from? They are a very late arrival, as the kinds of language that humans use itself is a very late arrival in ways of framing and forming relations with the thing that we are describing. So yeah, I would say there's no svabhava, there's no like relation independent own being. And I like Di Paolo references Madhyamaka on the very last page. So everything is a product, whatever, well, everything is a product. Well, I don't like the way of speaking particularly, but there are no formed entities, no even relatively stable realities in that sense outside of relational contexts. Nothing is floating off on its own in some abstract heaven or whatever without being enmeshed. Um, and just what the problem with what Rorty is saying is that it's just privileging a particular mode of engagement, a linguistically mediated mode of engagement, as though that is, and this is Varela's point about constructivism, right, and why he says he's not a constructivist, as though that particular mode of engagement, whether it's description or it's linguistically mediated or it's just cognitively mediated, depending on what we mean by cognition, as being the thing that fixes realities or the thing, all of the determination in reality is on the side of this cognizing or even linguistically describing being. And that's what Varela is saying that he rejects in constructivism. And I love that he says that because this is
Mhm.
a real problem with second order cybernetics, actually. And I mean, of course, Varela is somehow part of that as well. But when and it's not to say that Heinz von Förster didn't say a lot of really great stuff as well, or Bateson for that matter. But when von Förster is saying things like, the environment contains no information, um, and the Bateson is saying that it's not dissimilar to what you were saying, but you mean something different. He's saying it's just maps all the way down, maps of maps of maps of maps of maps, and nothing of the territory. This is a literal quote. Nothing, the territory doesn't get in at all. Or he says nothing of the territory gets in, or something like that. And it's like, but you are, in the way you're speaking, presupposing the existence of a territory that doesn't get in. I know, they're moving towards a certain way of speaking, um, and which we would be more happy to endorse. And
Yeah.
von Förster's, the environment in itself or whatever contains no information, again makes it sound, it's like this naive Kantian thing. It makes it sound like there is this environment out there, but it in
Yeah.
fact, as opposed to recognizing that the environment, and this is part of what von Förster is saying, is always correlative to the agent, is always, and as Ezekiel is saying, and it's very Simondonian, and and others will say this, that Viveki, right, would say agent and arena, but Simondon would say, organism and milieu, say, they can't, or individual and milieu, he would say actually, come into being simultaneously as one another's correlates. And von Förster is trying to say something like that, but the way he's saying it is not recognizing that all of the quote unquote environment is constituted by the same kinds of informative relationships amongst itself, which is why when the specific human subject agent comes to that quote unquote environment, it is not arbitrarily chunkable. It does already have all of this form that
Yeah.
we
Sedimented histories that
exactly.
resist our agency. Yeah.
Exactly.
hmm Yeah. I think there's something in what enactivism is proposing to find this middle path beyond the naive realism, constructivism binary would involve, there's a sharp, I mean, some enactivists say we can have representations, we can have our cake and eat it. Other enactivists are saying there is
Yeah.
no representation. But
Well,
I think,
Ezekiel is saying, sorry, at one point that he's criticizing mediational perspectives.
yeah,
And I totally get what he means, of course, and I think we're getting to this, but at the same time, you can't deny that there's mediation. And in fact, the identity dialectics, which he discusses right at the beginning of the paper, which is something in autopoiesis, autopoietic theory, that I have a real issue with, but is a claim about mediation.
hmm,
It's a claim that there is this constituted thing and it changes a little bit in its structure, but it maintains itself, which is because it's buffered, because its interaction with the milieu, whatever, is mediated by its own structure, or by its own organization, rather. And it's important to say that, and there's some truth to that, but at the same, there are some internally conflicting claims here, and we need to keep finding, which again is what I think Ezekiel is doing, this middle ground between them. And so the middle ground between constructivism and realism, right, is constructive realism. So I'm both a realist and a constructivist personally, even though I think I would probably reject the realism that Varela is summarily rejecting, and I certainly reject aspects of the constructivism that he's rejecting. But it's like the real is constructed in this ongoing and incredibly plural manner by all sorts of agents, and not only agents, because I
yeah.
don't think everything is an agent either. I'm not Latour, but yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I think we can approach something like um, description as representation in certain very specific, precise, formal language games, let's say. But I think the issue is more, well, what is language fundamentally?
Mm,
And I would say I'm with, the expressivist romantic tradition that language is primarily about participation, and actually before it is even an attempt to communicate anything, much less represent or describe something in that as if it were mind independent. It's much
mm,
more about forming the self. It's almost like the medium of consciousness, and there's a whole anthropological understanding of where language came from here that comes out of people like Owen Barfield and whatnot, where it's very tempting to think that language originates in grunts and points, And then sort of figurative and metaphorical language comes much later, whereas Barfield says, no, no, it's the exact opposite. Actually, language starts in poetry and song and music and expression, and then later becomes something that
Yeah.
allows us to designate things in the world and share attention and so on. That's a later achievement. Um,
I'm very obviously partial to the notion that it starts in music, like a non-representation, which is exactly your point. You know, music
Mhm.
is essentially a non-representational mode of expression.
Yeah.
Something is being communicated, or something is being made available through expression for sharing, so that we can coordinate psyches, consciousnesses, or we can share souls or whatever, soul making. But it is not discursive. It's not, there's no semantic or representational, right, content.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and this is at the end of the paper, but when he talks about Charles Taylor and logos and sensitivity to rightness and the sort of historically situated normativity, where logos, as Heraclitus would describe it, is about sort of tracing the rhythm of becoming, and that it's allowing us to enter into a relationship with not only ourselves um, and consciousness as a medium that language shapes, but world
Mhm.
as thou, as he put it. And I'm very curious to ask Ezekiel more about how he cashes that out and what that really means for him. But it's
Yeah.
language as a means of, before it is even a means of communicating, it's a way of speaking and listening to the world.
Mm.
I find, just because I'm a dyed-in-the-wool romantic, I think that really speaks to me. And I think
Yeah.
it helps avoid the rush to think that language is primarily or foundationally representational.
Yeah, yeah. But I do think it's important that a lot of that world, so this brings back the kind of communication aspect. And if we were going into animism of some kind, it would all be communication in a certain sense anyway. You know, there's a particular mode of relating amongst persons or agents or whatever. Um, but I think it's also just important that, you know, language as we know it, even if we're speaking of non-human language, it evolves and this, you know, we could go into chemical ecology here in really interesting ways too, actually, but signaling of different kinds, you know, it evolves, but language as we know it in particular evolves in social species. And so a huge component of that world that one is speaking to is in fact other aspects of that world that are very like oneself, like members of one's own species and community in many cases, right? And so in that sense, even if you're not communicating something specific, you're not like that rock over there or that bison or whatever, you are coordinating behavior in a certain way. You
Yeah,
are sharing something, right?
sure. I guess there's like, that's a very important point you're making. And I think I don't want to be read as saying that language is not a form of action that is coordinating the behavior of
Sure.
community,
Performative.
and it's coordinating the behavior of communities of organisms. It's just, I guess it's more about the form content split and when that happens, because
Yeah.
with like music as a non-representational language, I think there is no form content split, right? And well, I mean, maybe that's not obvious. Maybe we could talk about that, but I think in there's a way of thinking about natural language where we naively think, oh, I have a thought and I can say it in English, or I could translate it into German or French or whatever, and it would be the same thought, the same content, but different form conveying it. And I think that misses the irreducibility of the languages themselves as modes of expression.
Yeah.
The whole world that comes along with French that you can't just,
Right.
you know,
Yeah. But this is one of the issues, Matt, with the overly abstract distinction between operation and structure that
mm,
characterizes so much of the autopoietic and indeed, you know, enactive literature. And the thing is, there is a certain independence. And, you know, I guess Deleuze and Guattari might be talking about expression and content. We could talk about form and content. We could talk about ways of splitting those things in music and ways in which they're not. apart. I mean, but there are different ways of relating to something, different levels of analysis that we can take, where we can say that, there's a consistent operation here, which is kind of the form, maybe, and there's, a changing structure, which is kind of correlative to the content. I mean, you could almost reverse them, but
Mm.
you know, these are I think what you're saying is very, very salient. And I think what is important, and Ezekiel does gesture to this, he says it's not just the distinction now between, and I'm jumping a little bit, between sort of interaction, transaction, and constitution is not just relative to a temporal scale. Um, but it is in fact relative to and a spatial scale is also really important here, and we could nut out some details there. It is in fact when you posit a bunch of character states that are the identity, and then you separate those from a bunch of character states that are the structure and that you feel are arbitrarily varying in some sense. You've posited a particular level of analysis, and these things are at two different scales, such that you can define, terms of consistency on one level in relation to change on another level. And so, we can do this with language too. We can say that, a phrase in German and a phrase in English have essentially the same content, but it's at some level of abstraction that that notion of same, that notion of identity is
Yeah.
being brought in. If we get a little bit, which is what you were doing, closer to the ground, we're going to see that actually no, that was a stipulated level of abstraction that we chose to analyze those things at. And if we get close enough to it, we're going to see no, there are different worlds being brought forth here. And what I was worried about with the kind of early autopoietic literature, and I still worry about with the distinction between operation and structure, even though it's an important distinction to me in other ways, right? Um, is that there's a way of like some of this just does come out of the computationalist and early cybernetic thinking, um, and it's kind of like multiple realizability of programs running on different, like substrate independence with different, Turing machines can be realized using different substrates, all of that sort of stuff. Those are real and really important things, but the thing about operations and structures, as far as organisms are concerned, or as far as anything is concerned, is that they're not absolutely distinguishable. That it takes a certain, structure, a certain materiality, or whatever, to achieve a certain operation. And if we zoom out too much from the details, and we can talk about operational closure and all of that, which is obviously a favorite hobby horse of the chemical ecologist. Um, but if we zoom out too far from the ooey gooey wet details of these actual biological systems, and we keep talking about these diagrams of them, which are very useful and we need them, we risk a kind of collapse into a very naive and egregious form of functionalism. And I am a
Mm.
functionalist of a kind, right? An operationalist. And so these things, like I'm not dismissing those sorts of
I'm a
distinctions.
functionalist of a kind
Yeah,
too. I mean, James likes the term, and
yeah,
if we go
and
back
rightly.
to, yeah, if we want to go back 100 years to how it was being used in that, I mean, it is used in different ways in
Yeah,
different
and,
contexts and
but
overlapping meanings, but
yeah, just to say, if we go too hard on multiple realizability and the
yeah,
distinction between an operation and structure, or a form and matter, this is
right.
a form and matter
Yep, yep,
distinction. It's a
exactly.
hylomorphic distinction. And
Right.
like Simondon cautions us, this is always a post factum distinction. Like when you are analyzing the products of an individuation process, you've got some object that's relatively formed in front of you. You can say, well, I designate these character states to be the form, and these other ones are the matter. But that's not a real ontological distinction. It's an analytic distinction that you're making. And so blah 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 blah. I'm saying too many different things all at once. But when we get to this very interesting distinction that Di Paolo is making between interaction, transaction, and constitution, and we should probably say what each of them is. Just he's got one sentence definition for each of them, and then he unpacks them at certain level of analysis, everything is constitutive, which is what I think is where Di Paolo is going.
Yeah.
Um, But he says, is this distinction simply based on timescale? No, though timescale is sometimes a good guide to differentiate these modes of engagement, with interaction corresponding to the faster and constitution to the slower ends. Right, that might seem intuitive in some sense. Like a lot of things are changing, but in this interactive way, which is not really changing the form or whatever. At a very
Mm,
fast time scale, but over longer, like say evolutionary time scales, the whole constitution of the thing is changing, so the novel forms are being generated and all that. And that's actually true. That's 100% true. But actually, at the same time, when you zoom in on the spatial scale, so when you go to the micro
mm.
scale, the
Right.
things that are happening really fast all of a sudden turn out to be constitutive as well. You don't have to have long time scales. If you're looking at the organism at the level of its molecular constitution, the freaking thing is continually in flux.
Right.
And it's only because you happen to sit there and treat me as some medium-sized dry good or whatever, that I look the same over times, and it's easy for you to identify certain character states as belonging to the identity of Tim. But
Mm,
you wouldn't see those at my
yeah.
molecular level. You'd be like, this thing is constitutively changing all the time because of the way it's in a responsive and constitutively responsive relationship with its environment.
Right. Right. No, this just reminds me of the exchange you were having on Substack earlier with, I think she's a cognitive scientist, Andrea Hoyt.
Yeah, I think she.
And she had shared this image of a computer generated image of the flagellar motor, which freeze framed like that, you don't see. I mean, I presumably these structures are dissolving and reassembling relatively frequently and vibrating all over the place, and it's a lot more chaotic in reality than those images can make it seem. Um, and so at that level, you're exactly right. It's not only a time thing, it's a space or a scale thing. I mean, when you zoom in, what you thought was interactive is actually constitutive.
Yeah.
But also just on the functionalist multiple realizability thing, something that got brought out by you two in that exchange was how different research programs looking for correlations between genes and traits or whatnot will name genes different things
Yeah.
and think they have different functions because they were just looking at it with a different lens. And so
Yeah.
that idea that there's a gene with a function, just you can't, that's too abstract a way of thinking about it, because in the cell, you know, uh there's just many overlapping things going on all the time. It's very messy, right?
Yeah, I mean the way I say that, because even function is again a kind of level of abstraction, and it's concrete abstraction, right? This is also what I don't want to be seem to be saying. I'm not saying that human observers are making these abstractions, and in reality, there's no difference between operation and structure. No, the
Mhm.
system is, in some sense, concretely abstracting itself, which is the identity dialectics, by the way, that is being discussed in the early autopoietic stuff. It's not that that's not happening. It's just that when we discuss it at that level of abstraction, it can easily become obfuscatory. But one of the nuances that I was trying to bring into that exchange with Andrea, is the difference between activity and function as well.
Mhm.
And so this is a really important biological distinction, but it's one that pharmacologists don't really recognize. Because as far as a pharmacologist is concerned, a molecule's activity is what it does in the assay that they're using in the lab. I mean, sorry, a molecule's function is what it does in the assay that they're using in the lab. And I'm like, well, firstly, if you use different assays, it'll do different things. But those activities, and I say activity is a context-dependent property, and we make a property function distinction.
Mm.
Like a property is just something that, an entity of some kind happens to possess or happens to do. Um, so a character state that it kind of just happens to have, it may or may not be functional. And functional means it's associated with a particular end. It has been selected for either artificially or, naturally, whatever nuance in this where we apply this concept of function. But it's been selected to do something in particular. And so activities, what biomolecules do, varies contextually based on the availability of interaction partners So expressed in this tissue, it's going to, any given molecule, or really we're always thinking at the population level with molecules, because like individual molecules hardly ever do anything. They do sometimes, but often it's like there are stoichiometric effects. So you need a certain amount of receptor occupancy or whatever for an effect to actually be proliferated and that sort of stuff. But what molecules do, what a given class of molecules does, is going to be different in this tissue because the ecology of that tissue is different, right? Or the economy, if you want, but the availability of interaction partners, their abundance, their populations is going to be different. So the same gene product expressed in two different tissues has different activities, which may or may not be associated with different functions.
Mhm.
Um, and it's really kind of important because like an activity can also be totally arbitrary consequence of some off-target effect, like it can just be that the thing just happens to stick to things in a very, non-specific, non-guided way, because molecules do that. Um, Happens to have some small effect. And that's an activity, and certainly in an assay, when we're sometimes working at like a forensic level, we can detect these activities. They may have nothing to do, or they may be very tenuously related to what the molecule does in the life history of the organism that produces it in terms of its function. But they're nonetheless incredibly significant because that's part of this variation, this indeterminate layer of variation in an organism and between organisms that is grist for the mill of novel functions. So you
Mm.
need an activity to be available to be recruited as a function,
Yeah.
but an activity is not the same thing as a function. And if
Yeah.
an activity was the same thing as a function, we'd be adaptationists, and then the
Mm.
whole Darwinian mode of reasoning actually wouldn't work at all because you'd need
Right.
something outside the whole system that set it up so that everything works. But not
Yeah.
everything works.
And yeah, if everything had a function and there was no activity, that organism seems to me like it would be pretty fragile, actually. There-
Well, yeah, yeah, yeah. I
Um,
mean, quite possibly, but it wouldn't be able to evolve anyway. Like it wouldn't be
right.
adaptable.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
just need all that arbitrariness going on all the time so that novel functions can continually be recruited as required. And I think
Mm.
this gets us back to constitution in a certain way, like, because that,
Mhm.
again, over long periods of time, yes, at the macro level that we tend to think of identity at, we're going to see that the form of the thing is going to change in really obvious ways. Chimp becomes human, whatever. But at the moment to moment and day to day scale or whatever, at which levels of gene expression are varying a lot, and neuroplastic things are going on, and neural pathways are changing in their weights and the likelihood that things are going to go one way or another and all of that. The thing is constantly changing constitutively because
Yeah.
it's continually interacting with different environment, with
Yeah.
different aspects of
Let me share his definition of each of these. And just, he actually does say these distinctions are meant to be practical. There's room for choice by adopting a particular perspective of
yeah,
as
yeah, yeah.
observers, the choice of spatial and temporal scales to
Uh-huh.
redescribe a
Yeah.
transaction as an interaction, and so on.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but he says during interactions, each system retains its identity and its mode of operation, but their dynamics are codependent. During transactions, each system retains its systemic identity, but its mode of operation changes plastically so that both their dynamics and their structures are codependent. This is page 169, by the way.
Yep.
Um, During situations of mutual constitution, the system's own identity and organization are mutually defined and continuously shaped. They co-emerge moment to moment as metastable concretizations open to ongoing change at all levels. Um,
At all levels. I mean, yeah. No, I think he totally he's it's totally right. And I do think that his ontology is trending towards, and I didn't manage to reread the second half of the paper, but where I feel like it goes, today, where I feel like it goes is, it's really all constitutive in some
yeah. Oh,
sense,
yeah.
right?
Constitution
Um,
is the default. It's
yeah,
is what he says.
exactly.
Um,
When constitution can't possibly require things to change at all levels, which is what I think you just was at the end of that quote. Like
mhm.
levels are always they are spatiotemporal distinctions. They are going to be changing at different rates, at different scales, right? Temporal scales in that sense. So you can't the organism can't change in all at all levels in all of its parameters simultaneously, right? That kind of saltation is impossible. But there's saltation and phase shifts, blah blah blah, going on often at various levels. But even in a case of like genetic assimilation or a kind of Goldschmidtian hopeful monster thing, I mean, yeah, look, in development, there's a possibility of a degree of plasticity where a lot of levels are changing, but it's not going to be all the levels. And most of the kinds of change that we see is going to be, more restricted to one level or another, but it's still nonetheless going to be all constitutive, I think. And to be honest, I think there was a quote that I'll find. You can say something while I look for it, but this is to me a generic thing about physics as well. Like it's not really just a biological thing as such, but it's kind of just the way sort of frustration or a generalized notion of frustration in physics, like it requires a bunch of relations to be, in some sense, interfering with the inertia of each of the constituent entities. Relations block certain paths. Such that not everything can kind of just collapse to the surface of absolute stability or whatever. And that's how you get stable structure. Like things have to start interfering with one another and holding one another up. And then you get an object. That's like a condition of objecthood.
hmm hmm
So those to me are like constitutive relations because
Yeah. And I
yeah,
wonder, I mean, just to concretize this a little bit, um, with an example, I wonder how far you'd be willing to push this when I think about, um, Earth as a living system or as Gaia, and think about the role of organism, cellular life in shaping not only the atmosphere, but the lithosphere and the hydrosphere and the
yeah,
way in
yeah.
which there's no quote unquote like dead matter anywhere near the surface or above it that isn't
Mhm.
in some sense reconstituted by the processes of living organisms, by the metabolisms, the excretions and um, activities and or functions of organisms. And so when we think about the agent arena relationship or the organism environment relationship, at the planetary scale, it's very clear what's meant by saying that the default is constitution or constitutive,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
can
yeah.
can you really separate the two
Mm, mm.
um, at that scale? And so I just wonder when you think about Gaia,
Yeah.
um,
How do I feel
is
about Guy? I love her. I love her. Yeah, she
well,
gives
is
me
this is this an is that like the primary? I mean, Evan Thompson comes up with the word ecopoiesis because he says
yeah, yeah.
we don't want to refer to Earth as autopoietic. That would be too strong. But ecopoiesis, he thinks,
Yeah.
is
Yeah. Look,
close.
there just is no autopoiesis. So like, like as we've said before, it's all
It's all
symbiotic.
ecopoiesis and
All
symbiosis.
ecopoiesis. It's all
Yeah.
symbiosis. Yeah. Yeah. So something like 50% of all mineral species identified, which are like inorganic, like minerals,
Mhm.
are the result of something that organisms do. And I mean, of course, a lot of this can just be like oxidation and things like that, because the reason there's so much oxygen
Right.
is because of organisms.
That
Uh,
still counts.
oh, no, it definitely counts. It completely counts. I mean, yeah, look, of course, the biosphere is something that was arbitrarily, not intentionally, but constructed by organisms.
Hmm
Um, and it becomes a kind of self-sustaining thing because it becomes like, the great oxygenation event, the first mass extinction that we know of, and the only other one that we know of to have been like directly caused by another organism, which again, as I always say on our chats, tends to get left off the list for some reason. But it's like great oxygenation event that then becomes the background because it completely changes the environment at this very, very generic way. That then becomes the background that all subsequent organisms have to adapt to. It becomes the enabling constraint, therefore, of all subsequent evolution. And that's how these ecologies at these different scales get constructed, like a rainforest, like we know if you bulldoze a rainforest, it's actually got really shallow topsoil and you won't, you'll be like, whoa, look how lush these plants are. I could grow incredible crops on this ground. It's like, yeah, you get like one or two good yields and then it's gone because the rainforest is a self-sustaining ecosystem in that sense. It's created the conditions for its own
Hmm.
prospering, but not in a kind of, I don't know, it depends on how strong your notion of Gaia is. It's not that the rainforest is actually a unity in a sense, like because our conceptions of unity are derived from subjectivity, right?
Yeah.
Um, and the projection of that onto other well, maybe I don't want to go in that direction right now, but it's not a subject. It's not a unified system, which is like everything is cooperating with each other. There's
Hmm.
all kind, like it's an incredibly it's a multiplicity. Things are antagonistic, things are cooperating, things are always, excessive and expanding into like it's not unified, but it nonetheless creates the conditions, and we say it creates the conditions for its own, as though it is an entity. It's not an entity. It's not productive to think of it as an entity, in my opinion. That's just really abstract. Like
Yeah.
there is an operation that is rainforesting. I mean, yeah, kind of, but that doesn't tell
Yeah.
you much about how it actually works.
Right. I mean, and the same is true of the Earth.
Yeah,
It's obviously an open system, receiving a lot of sunlight and cosmic rays that probably help with
yeah.
mutations that drive evolution, and
Well,
we're
not
inside.
mutations, but like energy, like yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Um, and so, yeah, there aren't these sharp boundaries whereby we could refer to a unity, even in the case of the cell. I mean, autopoiesis is such an idealistic definition of the essence of life, that, like we were saying earlier, presumes closure when your discipline of chemical ecology is just filled with endless examples of how that can't possibly be the case. Um, but what's interesting, the oxygen crisis and how that um, affects how life can then unfold from that point forward. It drives all the anaerobic bacteria into hiding in a sense, and allows for oxygen breathing life to come onto the scene. When he talks about in relationship to each of these forms of engagement, interaction, transaction, and constitution, um, there's a different form of production of potentiality and possibility. And it's like that oxygenation crisis um, made it brought forth a concrete possibility. I think I'm using his terminology correctly there, that there would be, new forms of more energetic forms of life that can breathe oxygen and utilize that extra energy, which was otherwise toxic. And so it's a constitutive uh, event that leads to a new concrete possibility, which is, animals like us, right? And so I think I think Ezekiel, like you, would probably want to say that that was the realization of an adjacent possibility.
Yeah, well,
Um,
just to interfere, interrupt again. I don't think the possibility of organisms like humans specifically, is concrete for billions of years after the oxygenation event, right? This
mhm.
is a big difference between me and like Whitehead. I don't think those possibilities exist in any definite sense until they're like really adjacent.
Yeah, yeah. So that's too far for adjacency in billions of years in the future. But the first oxygen breathing
Sure,
organisms that,
exactly. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah,
we're,
absolutely. Yeah.
hmm
It's like I mean Kaufman does discuss these things really well in terms of exaptation, which of course is very, very dear to my heart. But so he'll talk about the evolution of a swim bladder, which creates a niche for now a parasitic worm can inhabit that. And in no sense could you say that the kind of form of the swim bladder as niche for the parasitic worm pre-existed the creation, the construction of that potential niche in the form of the swim bladder itself. And this is very much akin to, because the whole thing I was saying about activities and functions before is entirely a story about exaptation, right? So the activity, um, the like when you take a molecule out of an organism and put it in an assay and it has some kind of toxic effect, like it kills cells or interferes with their, neurotransmitter, like it interferes with their signaling, um, it has a neurotoxic effect or a cytotoxic effect or whatever. Like I was saying, that's an activity that it has in the very specific context of that assay, which is not necessarily a function. But as an activity, it's grist for the mill of selection for turning into a function, which is exaptation, basically, right? So when
Mhm.
you have a protein, say, that has this particular structure, which gives it a propensity for interacting with something in a way that interferes with some other process, blah, 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 you then have this possibility that if things come together in a very evental way, and this is a very Simondonian way of thinking as well, in the hink et nunc, in the here and now, if things, there's a certain confluence, which I talk about in terms of elicitation, where we can again get relatively concrete about this and say that when the lizard bites the target or bites the organism that it's feeding on, if it just so happened to be expressing enough of a certain enzyme in its saliva which had an antimicrobial function normally, but it just enough of that got introduced into that target organism through the infliction of that bite wound in order to slow down the target organism a little bit, such that the lizard was slightly more likely to subdue it and actually get a meal. Oh, suddenly things have come together in a certain way. And lots of things might have to come together. The metabolic state of the target organism might have had to be just right for that bioactivity to be potent enough, at the concentrations that were present in the, like it becomes like really, really nitty gritty and messy when you talk about the details, and it doesn't invalidate the abstract levels of discussion, but it just relativizes them and shows how abstract they are in some sense. But yeah, it's
Mhm.
always this, to me, it's like another way of putting it is, to think in sort of quasi-geometrical terms. But if you think about like as soon as a protein structure comes into existence, as a derivation from some other protein structure, there's a whole bunch of adjacent possibles that are quasi-definite at this point because they're only one or two or whatever mutations away. And you wouldn't need to change the scaffold, we would say, the backbone of that protein, the like, more macro level structure of the protein. You just have little point mutations, and all of those suddenly come into a certain degree of resolution as adjacent possibilities by virtue of the existence of this particular evolvable protein scaffold. But there's
Mhm.
no sense really, like it's totally projective, in my opinion, to imagine that those possibilities in any definite way pre-existed the origin. This is just kind of the point that I'm always trying to make about ontogenesis and stuff. I would love to talk, I've talked for way too long. I love to talk, but about the way he talks about concrete and abstract, and because he gets a bit Simondonian, and then he says it's also a bit Whiteheadian and stuff. And there's some stuff I'd want to say about that discussion, but
Yeah, I think we could go there. We could go there next. I mean, I had open his diagram of an act and
ah,
his attempt to avoid, not to say that we can't think about uh,
yeah.
an event, say, as, in terms of an agent coming with preconditions and an environment with preconditions, and then something happens in the present.
Yeah,
But he doesn't want us to imagine that the agent and the environment are already concretized prior to
yeah,
that
yeah,
encounter. And I immediately, because of my interest in psychedelic studies, thought of set and setting as an example of how we imagine, a subject, a person already with their set, and then the environment, the setting, and those two come together in the psychedelic experience, which and Ezekiel admits, like, it's not that we can't think of it this way, but there's a danger here, and he's trying to do a much more enactive interpretation of this, and yeah, drawing on Simondon and Whitehead, who are thinkers of the event in a way that allows us to see the mutual the way in which agents and environments are mutually constituting each other, and that we need to be very careful about where we assign concreteness and where we
yeah.
assign um, possibility, right? So,
Yeah. One of the things just to say is that the map itself, in some sense, this sounds representational, right? But the diagram the abstraction, is itself a concrete thing in the world. It's just not the same thing as the thing that it, in some sense, is mediating or kind of there is representation in the world, is representing
Mhm.
or whatever. And that's just all we have to keep remembering.
But yes, and that particular representation is, when they talk about knowledge in an active paradigm, knowledge is always action. Um,
Hmm.
every time we describe something, we're not only changing ourselves, we're changing
Yeah,
the world,
yeah,
right? And
yeah,
so
yeah,
that easy understanding of whatever representation is, the mediational frame or whatever, needs to be challenged because
yeah,
even just to draw out this map, you've changed the territory because people are going to
yeah.
start using it and it's not going to line up perfectly with the territory, but they're going to think it is. And then all of a sudden there's a new trail that shouldn't be there, you know?
Well, and
Um,
this makes me think of psychedelics again, and some stuff
mm,
I've written about, assimilation of experience of the numinous to adjacent norms. It's
yeah,
like when you have those adjacent norms, like say myths, religious stories, whatever it is, manuals of contemplative practice,
yeah,
all of that kind of stuff. Um, those are not the experiences themselves, obviously, but they may have been inspired by certain experiences, but then they also feed back on the possibility of the experience. Someone now having an experience that they can't make any sense of because it is beyond, it's excessive with regard to sense,
yeah,
will then go and find that text and be like, oh, that's what happened to me. It's
right.
like, well, kinda, not
Do you know
exactly.
this book, Darwin's Pharmacy by Richard Doyle?
I do know that book. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, he thinks of psychedelics, he calls them rhetorical adjuncts, I think, and he talks about
Mhm.
arrowid.org,
Yeah. Yeah.
which
I used
I
to spend
think
a lot of
still,
time on there.
yeah, no, same. And
Yeah.
I've talked with the creators of it years ago, and he was both praising it. He's like, "Oh, I'm so glad this website exists," but also, this is kind of canalizing people's
Oh yeah,
experiences.
yeah, yeah. Like all the trip reports and stuff. Yeah. No, totally. Yeah. No, it's really fascinating, and that again is this constitutive thing to the broader and active point, right? So I would again say it's not that mediation doesn't occur. Mediation has to occur, and if you have a distinction between operation and structure, or like a notion of identity, you are already in that space of speaking about, mediation. But it's that mediation is itself a thing in that it doesn't float free of the world. It's itself a kind of action in the world. Just like, I was having an exchange with Michael James on Substack as well, and he was talking about how maybe he thinks where my thought is going, and you would agree with him, but for totally different reasons, is kind of away from metaphysics in some sense, is like past metaphysics. And I'm like, well, I'm actually trying to say that we can do metaphysics, but in a really different way. Because then he was saying, because it ends up all being about action, and I agree with him about it being about action, but I'm like, but metaphysics is like a practice as far as I'm concerned, like it is an action, like tapping away on my keys or talking to you or thinking, that might be and this Dennett would say actually, that's like a
Yeah.
hidden behavior. It's not that thinking is not a behavior, it's
Yeah.
that it's a cryptic behavior.
No, I
Um,
just had a very similar exchange with Michael about he was getting on me about Plato being so disembodied, and I just said reading dialogues and any reading is an embodied practice, so
Sure, sure, sure. And I mean, it is depicting an embodied practice as well, right? As opposed to just writing, he's actually situating. So it's speculative fiction, I would call it, what Plato is doing by giving it by giving it a context and, oh, this thing just happened in the agora or whatever, and now we need to,
yeah, it helps us avoid thinking we might explain away persons in
yeah,
dialogue by
yeah,
reference to
yeah.
some sort of subpersonal, yeah.
Yeah, nice, nice. So I, should we turn to this thing on the concrete and abstract little, it's like a footnote that he has on some page somewhere. Uh,
Yeah, it's footnote 11, I believe. Wait, that's not it. It's footnote
footnote 10 on page
10.
13 or 171. Yeah. So he says, and is very Simondonian at a certain point, but then I also want to just talk about a little bit of some other things Simondon says. I don't necessarily think that Simondon is also the most consistent, always the most consistent thinker. Um, Anyway, so Di Paolo says, briefly, a process or an entity is said to be more concrete than abstract the more it is embedded in a set of relations with other processes or entities. I mean, this is quite Simondonian. And then, of course, he uses A technical example, as Simondon would like to do, a carburetor lying on a table is less concrete than the same carburetor working as part of a car engine. A passage towards increased concreteness is sometimes called concretization. Okay, that's Simondon's term. A little bit different from concrescence, but I mean, pretty similar in some respects. Of
Hmm.
course, Simondon is specifically elaborating it in the context of, technical evolution,
Yeah.
technicity, which is a big difference, but there are obviously resonances. Sometimes called concretization, sometimes individuation or actualization. Virtual relations describe as yet non-actualized concrete potentialities. They contrast with counterfactuals in the sense that they are adjacent or neighboring a concrete situation, things that might be about to happen as opposed to things that are conceivable. Like I think that's all actually really well, nicely put. There might be a difference also in the way that he's using virtual to the way Deleuze would use it as well, and that's kind of interesting because, like, a few things to say. Well, I read a couple of Simondon quotes if you'll bear with me,
Mhm.
just on this, right? Because I pulled some up. So Simondon from Individuation in Light of Notions of Form and Information, page 352. Um, this charge of the undetermined can be called nature. I like that, but not everybody likes that. Anyway, it must not be conceived as pure virtuality, which would be an abstract notion arising to a certain extent from the hylomorphic schema, but as a veritable reality charged with potentials actually existing as potentials, i.e., as an energy of a metastable system. The notion of virtuality must be replaced with that of a system's metastability. Um, so here, the virtual is an operational, not a substantial concept, is kind of what he's trying to say. It's not that there's like, this is related to our conversation with Mike yesterday. It's not that there's this other realm that's the virtual. It's that things can exhibit virtuality. Things can operate in this virtual manner, like as potential. So it's not an abstraction. It's not substantially opposed to the actual. It's an aspect of being. It's the thing in its firstness, in some sense, to go a little bit Persian. Elsewhere, Mode of Existence of Technical Objects, page 168 to 169, he also has this to say, which I think is a really good cautionary thing. The potentials of a system constitute its power of coming into being without degradation. They are not the simple virtuality of future states, but a reality that pushes them into being. Coming into being is not the actualization of a virtuality or the result of a conflict between actual realities, but the operation of a system with potentials in its reality. Coming into being is a series of spurts or structurations of a system or of successive individuations of a system. I mean, there'd be a lot to unpack to get through all the details there, but the key thing is it's not the actualization of a virtuality, where he's conceiving virtuality as like the future possibilities or something like that. It's actually that the system is charged and is constantly pushing out into these adjacent zones. And that is what is causing the actualization of novel states. It's not that there's like, he's not necessarily denying the existence, like that we ideate a future possibility and then we try to bring that about. But he's saying that's not the generic thing. And we sometimes, like in metaphysics, it's kind of often that model is generalized.
Right.
And so, just last thing, because I have a little note. So, yeah, virtuals are not just waiting to be actualized. I think the adjacent possible, obviously. I don't know if it's worth considering, or maybe it's just too much, the distinction between the virtual and the possible in Deleuze. It's kind of like the latter, the possible, are a subset in a certain sense of virtual things or things that are exhibit virtuality. And again, the key thing is that things that exhibit virtuality can be actual. So there's not this, substantial distinction between the actual and the possible in this thought necessarily. So it's like I would say with like stochastic gene expression or something. There are all of these, actual individual, individuated molecules that are
Mhm.
floating around in and between cells and jiggling and blah blah blah. But what's virtual about them is their possible relative canalizations. It's like the way that different distributions of them could be associated with different phenotypes. So at one level, they're already actualized, they're already individuated, but at another level, they're actually pre-individual. They are the potential for different individual organisms to emerge.
Mhm.
So there's not, and I mean, I would just say this to Mike. I don't imagine he'll be listening to this, but I'm not saying that there isn't like some other realm or something like that as such. But I'm saying there isn't always a need for it. Like it's often the case that you can get this conception of real possibility. So it's real possibilities. It's very much not deterministic conception, but from a closer analysis of the way the actual is actually stratified. Um,
Yeah.
something, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Scale. Like, why does anything maintain its shape? Well, because things change at different rates at different scales, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that
Um,
essential idea. So invariance to our broader conversation, and actually what I was saying to Ben this morning, you know, I'm not saying that invariance is not an operation that exists. It's like at any given scale, that scale is going to be defined by its invariant. Like you
yeah.
wouldn't, how can you define a scale except by the things that don't vary at that scale, right? They define a kind of window, and then you say within that scale, these are the variants, and these are the variables, and these are the invariants. But
Hmm.
I'm saying it's not fundamental. This is a different conversation than the one we're having, but I'm saying it's not a
Well,
fundamental. Go, yeah,
yeah. No, it's just interesting because if we put a smallest scale, like a bottom level to this, that's privileging invariance, presumably. But if we
exactly.
don't put a smallest scale on it, then it seems to me that we end up in the place where I'm always trying to land of having the polarity, where neither one is reducible to the other.
Well, this is where I go into this kind of like I definitely reject that notion of a smaller scale and a bigger scale. Like these are like in not exactly in medias res, but yes, they are relative designations always, right? They're bigger and smaller, right?
Yeah,
And
no, we reach a limit in our ability to
we do.
observe, say, and we can't say whether there is more or not behind
Yeah,
beyond that.
yeah. Well, I'm saying we reach limits, but those limits are not metaphysical. But what I'm saying then, or trying to say, I know it's weird, and sometimes I'm still grappling with ways of saying it, but it's like um, what we are reaching in a limit is something that is indeterminate, right? So at the limit is always indeterminacy, right?
Mhm.
And so I align indeterminacy and indefiniteness with variability, with a capacity to be many different things. And so then I say, but I'm not saying that there is like a thing or a substance that's varying that we're encountering at the limit, right?
Right.
That would be the old sort of some sort of substance metaphysics. And then I would be saying there's an invariant, which is the variational substrate. I'm saying, no,
Mhm.
we just are encountering kind of variation as such or indefiniteness as such. And if we were to say, I'm arguing, not necessarily successfully, but if we were to say that invariance was equally co-primordial, I mean, primordial is also a problem here. It's like equally at the limit. Um, we would always be saying that there is a thing there because invariance is the operation that defines thingness.
Yeah.
Like
Yep.
it's the operation of identity, it's the operation of substance. And I'm saying so they can't be equally limit cases.
No.
Because if invariance was at the limit, you'd always be saying, no, we are in fact encountering, that substance at the edge of everything
Right.
that
I
before
think
everything
I
or
think
after.
I mean, my assumption is that something very much like this precise issue is what led Whitehead to adopt the term creativity
I think so.
in
Yeah.
Process and Reality, or maybe it was in Religion in the Making, but in Science in the Modern World, he still refers to that as substantial activity. And
Uh,
he seems to be gesturing towards Spinoza there. The infinite
yeah.
substance is
Yeah.
it's not a static substance. It's a substantial activity, natura
Yeah.
naturans,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Not to say that you're closer to Spinoza than you might realize, because that might really upset you. But
Well, you wouldn't be the first, and actually, I was just going to. I mean, you definitely wouldn't be the first, but this is something that's coming up a lot, and I'm meeting with Jason Tuckwell right after this, right? So something that's like he's really wants because he really rejects Spinoza, but he wants to challenge me by saying that I'm more Spinozist than I should be, essentially, right? And he's one of the ones who's been challenging me to refine my expression so that it doesn't sound as though what I'm
Mm,
saying is there is this fundamental natura naturans, that everything is somehow like continually, assimilable to. And I'm like, that's definitely not what I'm saying. But
right,
I recognize how adjacent it is to what. So I think that there's heaps of things downstream of that Spinoza is saying that I would affirm. But it's the way that everything keeps turning back on unity, everything keeps turning back on substance and this assimilation thing that I'm like, no, that's just projection. Um, that because you encounter things with boundaries and things that are like, units at some scale that you encounter them, then you are like, and also because you're a rationalist and you want to guarantee your entire scheme in some way, you're like, well, there must be a biggest thing, there must be a smallest thing, all of that. And I'm like, that's just illusion, like, or delusion. Um, it's just not a meaningful statement. I mean, I'm almost, I don't want to be trending analytic in my philosophy in this point, but I am basically saying like those just aren't well-formed statements. Those are like when you proceed formally, you will postulate some criterion of that kind in order to guarantee the coherence, unity, consistency of your formal system. You'll likely need to do that. But the history of 20th century mathematics just shows us how stipulative that is. It's like, there's no guaranteeing the coherence, unity, consistency, completeness of the formal system. That just is an incoherent notion. Um, which is, you know, has been very substantial, has been proven, to be true, right? In the formal realm, which is the only realm that ever really had the justification for positing that principle of ultimate continuity or consistency anyway. So where in its own home base, it's been refuted. Like in experience and empirical reality and stuff, no, we don't encounter shit like that at all. We encounter little versions of it which are very scale relative, but we don't encounter the one in that sense, right? And this opens onto a lot of ongoing discussions between you and me and many other things. And lots of people say we do encounter the one, but I'm like, no.
Yeah. I mean, what did you, this is more towards the end of the paper, but when he was
Yeah,
getting into Madhyamaka and
yeah,
dependent co-origination and groundlessness, which to Western ears sounds like a lack of something, and he
yeah,
uses the
yeah,
phrase that, um, what did he say? It's more, I mean, my gloss on it was it's more like a fountain than
yeah,
a lack rather than foundation, say.
yeah,
Um, Foamy shimmering abundance is what Ezekiel referred to as
yeah,
the groundless ground. Do you
yeah,
think? I mean, and Madhyamaka was what in the embodied mind in 1993, was it? When or Varela Thompson and Eleanor Roche published that book on
yeah,
introducing enactivism. Really, they went to this Madhyamaka school of thought to gesture towards an ontology. Um, Do you think that
yeah.
that gets at what you're trying to point at with variation, or is it?
I mean, yeah, I do think it does actually. And I mean, we've talked about this before, sort of 10 years ago or so, I was just really, when I encountered, obviously much later than these guys, but, encountered Madhyamaka and particularly the work of Jay Garfield. But I think Jay is very militantly hardline on certain things that I'm not going to endorse. So this is not an
Yeah,
endorsal.
he's more of a skeptic. He's like a Humean Madhyamika or something.
Sort of, yeah. Well, there's Prasangika and Svatantrika distinctions, right? And we talked about this when we
Yeah.
discussed the dialogue between. And I think there's something really important about that kind of skeptical, I'm not erecting a positive thesis, Prasangika kind of approach. But I think, to keep it really simple, I think this is a matter of like dependent co-origination, right? So there can't be substance in the Spinozan sense because there's no independent origination, and that's what substance is definitionally. It's like the thing that exists by virtue of itself. Um,
Yeah. But
you know,
I mean, that's why I think Spinoza tries to avoid that issue that you get in Descartes, say, where
yeah,
you have two substances, whereby
yeah,
gesturing
yeah,
towards an
yeah, yeah,
infinite,
yeah, yeah. I
an
agree.
infinite substance that doesn't originate. It just is,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, well, I know existence is default, and I mean, I think that's kind of right in a way. I can't get into a discussion of Spinoza, A, because I don't know him well. I don't know him well enough. I mean, I've read a fair bit, and
Yeah.
I have read a lot of a fair bit of secondary stuff, and even I said Brooke Zipperin, who I was reading quite a bit of recently, who's like this in so many ways. He's a scholar of like Taoism and Chinese Buddhism, Tiantai Buddhism, and he's just a beautiful writer on emptiness and a theology, which he takes from Bataille, right? And he writes very lucidly about Bataille, but he thinks Spinoza is an ally. And he writes beautifully about Spinoza, and he has like this in the book Experiments in Mystical Atheism, something like that, which is a really nice book, which I actually really want to return to because I didn't read the whole thing. But he's got like a 12-part description of Spinoza's scheme, which is really, really lucid. And there's a lot that I like about it, but it keeps returning to this, you know, I think there's a way that Spinoza sort of fudges things with these, infinities of infinities, but that somehow he's trying to eat all the cake like every rationalist, like it's
Mm.
all just the one thing, but it's an infinite thing. So don't worry that it's only one thing because it's got everything. It's got everything
Yeah.
you could ever need just in this one thing. So why would you ever need more than one thing? Because the one thing has all the things. Um, I think that that's actually, and I couldn't possibly go up against someone like Zipperin, obviously, in his, you know, the way he analogizes that with Taoism and Buddhism. But I think there's a really, and certain forms of Buddhism, I think there's a really fundamental difference. Um, that, I think what's being said with, the sort of not self and the various marks of existence in those Buddhist traditions, dependent co-arising, impermanent, all of that, impermanence, and also the way that Nagarjuna speaks about the two truths and the sort of conventionality of ultimate truth and all of that. But emptiness, the doctrine of emptiness, um, it's something to do with constitutive alterity. It's this doctrine of constitution that Di Paolo is talking about here. And this is what my talk at ASCP, Australasian Society of Continental Philosophy, was last year. I mean, it was a critique of physicalism and rationalism, um, but about the need for alterity, right? Why you can't have a closed system at the base of things, because you always need the other, right? And I think that's really what's being said in these Buddhist doctrines. And so it makes no sense in the sense that it's just hopelessly abstract to go beyond those relations, that relational meshwork of groundless grounds, as Di Paolo says, and posit a ground that isn't that is required for that to be built upon. It's like, no, now you have stepped off the deep end into a kind of metaphysics, which I don't think we should do anymore.
Mhm.
I don't think that's synonymous, that classical conception of metaphysics. I don't think that's not what I mean when I say metaphysics. Um, but that's what a lot of Western, especially metaphysics, has been, and I just don't think we need to go that far.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, the other thing when you were reading the Simondon quotes, just because I've been hanging out with my colleague Jack and learning Jack
Yeah,
Bagby
yeah,
and
yeah,
learning about his reading of Aristotle, which is a very Bergsonian like process reading of Aristotle. But I think what I've been gathering from him is that the original Greek really does get flattened and made to seem like these form matter distinctions when they're translated into English or,
wow,
whatever contemporary European language. It makes them seem more separable than
yeah,
Aristotle
yeah,
intended.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that what Simondon is trying to describe there with pre-individual potentialities and the virtual, it's, that for Aristotle, there is no matter that's not preformed, and there is no form independent of materiality. And it seems to me that what the real achievement of someone like Simondon is in critiquing holomorphism. It's not so much a critique of Aristotle; it's a critique of a really flattened, inherited reading that's been chewed up through multiple languages and translated over thousands of years into something not only oversimplified, but just quite divorced from what
yeah.
Aristotle was talking about. And
I
that,
think Simondon would agree with you.
mm,
Aristotle is this most incredibly important synthetic thinker for Simondon, but
mm,
it's like hylomorphism. It's a post factum analysis again, like the separation of a thing into these
right.
distinct. That's what I was trying to get at, and I tried to put too much in that talk. In the my talk for the Platonic Symposium, I was like,
Hmm.
look, it's not that hylomorphism is like wrong or like bankrupt, or it's an analytic schema, and it's actually useful, but it's
Right.
not ontological in that sense, right?
Sure.
Um,
Yeah, but it just, I mean, and how we relate to the history of philosophy, which is, what we've been talking about here, I think
mm,
there's a way in which and this is I'm teaching Hegel this semester, so I'm prone to think this that Hegel thinks there's one idea that's been trying to work itself out through the whole history of philosophy, and different schools of thought approach it in different ways and even conflict with each other, and you engage in the dialectic of contradictions, but that beneath that we're all trying to say what can't be said. And so is metaphysics really possible? Maybe not, but we keep striving for it. And the
Yeah.
idea of the true account, the true account, I would say is always a regulative ideal. And I very much like Peirce's way of thinking about, we do this because we imagine that some future community, and this is what Derrida is saying too, in a sense, with deferral, there's some future community that might be in a position to pronounce upon this, but we should never assume that we've arrived at that, right?
Yeah, yeah. But I just, and I agree that it's an interest, it's important to recognize that as a regulative ideal, but I actually don't find the what Whitehead would call rationalist ambition. And you very
Adventure of rationalism, I think, is how
well,
he.
he says rationalist ambition somewhere
Mm,
in the like 50s, like page numbers of Process and Reality.
PR.
I
Mm.
got it right here, but I don't know if I have it bookmarked in the right place. Probably not. So I won't try. Oh, it's not far from this point. But anyway, but I won't. It'll take too long to do that. But the ambition of rationalism is that being is intelligible in the last instance, but we will never achieve that degree of intelligibility, right? We will never uncover. And I mean, Peirce even enshrines this in his evolutionary realism with, what we like to call the eschato the crystal at the end of time, the real but inexistent, So he's saying it's not a like it's a real factor in reality, like it's part of reality, this conception, but it's not something that will ever actually occur. Um, but that in some sense, what characterizes the trajectory of the evolutionary process is this move from completely indefinite, undetermined homogeneity, pure firstness, to pure secondness, which is a completely determined final state of things,
Hmm.
um, the crystal, and I'm just like, that's a really pernicious idea. I don't think that there's good evidence. See, the thing is, it becomes a really self-fulfilling idea in the sense that when we make models of a certain kind and we define conditions of closure in order to achieve a certain kind of analytic tractability, and then we forget that that's why we define the conditions of closure and we project that onto the world, we do end up with things like heat death or whatever. We end up with conceptions which have actually been extrapolated from our models, but we've projected them onto the world. And it's because I don't know, but there's a strong tendency to think in this way that, evolution, for example, a process of history proceeds from an alpha to an omega, but that's also enshrined in our conception of reasoning and logic, right? That you have an alpha, which is a set of axioms, and you unfold the consequences of the axioms into there, and it's truth preserving and all of that if it's deductive. Like the thing is, it's very bound up in a particular way of seeing the world. And we know that a lot of other cultures, we referenced, Buddhism, if we're in the Vedic context, we would obviously be thinking more about like cyclical conceptions and whatever. And many other, cosmological conceptions from other cultures don't really have a similarly linear conception of time at all, I would say, I would guess. I mean, I would think. Um,
Hmm.
so it's a particular way of viewing things. And it's bound up in this notion of, the community at the end of time, because that crystal at the end of time for Peirce is in principle, it's pure intelligibility, right? So you've gone from firstness, which is pure indefiniteness, to pure secondness, which is pure determinacy, that's pure intelligibility. It's completely knowable. And it's dead. And that is, in fact, Peirce's conception. It's a fossil, right? But
Hmm.
doesn't Jung, if we bring him into the conversation, have really nice critiques of this in answer to Job that you and I have discussed, like the final solution of revelation? And isn't it interesting how all the people in the kingdom of pure light who are ascended, the chosen ones, are all freaking crystals. It's
Yeah.
like
I
they
don't
are,
like that vision, the image of the crystal. I don't
yeah,
quite like. What I like is the community of inquiry
yeah,
being required because that's to me,
yeah,
it's the pragmatist orientation. It's more like Donna Haraway's understanding of situated objectivity that like, but for him to say that you just have the crystal of pure intelligibility at the end of time with no community who's,
yeah,
you know, I like his other way of thinking about that.
yeah, yeah. Because he has a parallelism in his conceptions,
Mm,
so it's
yeah,
kind of like inquired versus speculative at that point. You've got a
right,
community of
right,
inquiry, that's an epistemic conception, and
sure,
then you've got a speculative notion of evolutionary realism, which is a metaphysical conception, and
right.
he parallels them, like they are consistent with one another. But the consistent speculative conclusion of the regulative ideal of the community of inquirers who could arrive at the absolute truth is the
Hmm.
frozen dead world.
Right, right. I mean, just because I have my Word doc of process and reality, I think what
Uh,
Whitehead says here is relevant. I couldn't find the rationalist ambition. Is that what? But
yeah,
he does say he talks about the faith and the intelligibility of things.
yeah. What
Um,
this?
this is on page 42.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
Yeah, no,
he
this is
says
definitely the section I'm thinking of. Yeah,
He says, in itself, this faith does not embody a premise from which the theory starts. It is an ideal which is seeking satisfaction, and insofar as
yeah,
we believe that, we are
yeah,
rationalists. There
yeah,
must, however, be limits to the claim that all the elements in the universe are explicable by theory, for theory itself requires that there be given elements so as to form the material for theorizing. And then he points to Plato as the genius in the Timaeus, really pointing this out that the intellect meets the cora, and you're never going to
yeah,
get out of that
yeah,
situation of
yeah.
givenness. Um, so I think Whitehead is definitely uh, on a rationalist adventure for
The
sure, but
hope. Yeah, I think I'm saying the hope. I said the ambition,
the hope of
the
rationalism,
hope
yeah.
of rationalism, and the faith which forms the motive for the pursuit of all sciences. I reject that claim. I mean, I think it's a beautiful passage, and I agree with him about Plato.
Hmm.
Um,
You don't
like
think
I
science depends on a faith in the intelligibility of things?
I don't think science depends on a faith in the completability of the project of science, right? It depends on the faith that that there is a regional degree of intelligibility that we can uncover. But you know
Hmm.
what? And we'll get there in a second because Di Paolo addresses this right at the end and I think he says it really nicely. Um, but well, I mean, so just to read what DePaulo says,
Yeah.
um, you know, so back to he talks about John Wheeler actually, which is interesting. Um,
Hmm.
Obviously, Wheeler has this notion of the participatory universe, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
no, I love this. Yeah.
so he says then, Wheeler, who often referred in his own writings presumably independently from Varela and others, or maybe not, but De Paula doesn't attribute an influence. In his own writings to Machado's image of laying down the path and walking, asks us to imagine a variant of this game. So it's the game of 20 questions where you enter a room with other players who've agreed to think of a person or an object and can only provide yes or no answers.
Hmm.
Eventually, if you ask your questions cleverly, you may guess the correct answer. Okay, that's the Persian and Whiteheadian notion, right? Eventually, if we ask the right questions of nature, we will reveal its full intelligibility. It's the regulative ideal that we will reveal that, right? Um, but Wheeler's asking us to imagine this
I don't know
invariant.
if that is the Whiteheadian view. I
Fair
mean,
enough, fair enough, fair enough, fair
I
enough.
thought it was, but go ahead,
No,
finish it.
no, fair enough. I realize I was caricaturing. But imagine there is no pre-given answer. As you start asking questions, the other players respond yes or no at will, with the only constraint that each response should be consistent with the previous ones. That's actually a Persian notion of habit formation, that once something has happened, it is likely to happen again, right?
Hmm.
That is also David Deutsch's notion of knowledge or truth. So Deutsch would say that I guess knowledge is that kind of pattern that once it comes into existence is likely to maintain itself. something
Mm.
like that. And
Yeah.
Deutsch is channeling Popper more than anybody, right? But it's of course going to be very consistent with Peirce because there's so much in the epistemology that's it's funny, like in very different ways, both Popper and Whitehead seem to be like referring to Peirce, but kind of denying. I know there's a specific story about Whitehead and Hartshorne and all that, which we've talked about before, but there's like so much in common that both of them have with this obvious major precedent for both of their
Yeah.
thought, that they both sort of deny having any familiarity with until late in their lives. It's quite interesting. I'm not
Mhm.
saying that either of them were liars, although I would say Popper was much more likely to be a liar than Whitehead based on what I know of his character. Sorry, sorry, Carl, but I gather you were a bit of a dick. But anyway, so yeah, the only constraint is that each response should be consistent with the previous ones. This variant of the game can still converge to a right answer, only its rightness is internal to the process of inquiry itself, a process of fact making. The answer did not exist before the questions were posed, it was brought forth by the questioning. Okay, that's Bachelard as well, by the way. That's
Mhm.
Bachelard's epistemology, which is a creative epistemology in some sense, right? Um, we're kind of like Bachelard also says realists are idiots. And he thinks we need to be rationalists, right? But again, the funny thing is his conception of those things is again like different. But so science is a creative endeavor for Bachelard, and we are sort of, in some sense, we're creating conditions of knowability, but those are in fact bringing forth a particular kind of reality in this ongoing manner because especially through technology and all of that we end up manipulating reality based on the things that we learn. We use a little bit of knowledge to bootstrap ourselves into more manipulation, which changes the reality and blah blah blah. Which is
Yeah.
very much something Simondon takes over before him. The answer did not exist before the question was posed. So what this implies to me, right, is yeah, I mean there is a rightness, right? There's a situation dependent, context specific, local rightness that has been co-constructed, but there's no final rightness because to the extent that we keep asking questions or that, becoming is a continual process of problematization, um,
Mhm.
in a sort of Simondonian but vein, there is no possible like the notion of the regulative ideal of the community of inquirers which gets to the truth with a capital T is invalidated by this conception because there is no final truth. There are
The
just
ideal of the ideal being realized is invalidated, but I think I
no,
hear I
yeah, sorry. I think that the ideal is global, whereas what this is saying is that all rightness is context dependent. And so,
Mhm.
I could learn something correct at some particular scale, which generally speaking is going to afford me a more effective action in the world, which is, what knowledge
Mhm.
is about, right? Um, without being too
Yeah.
instrumentalist, because we are talking about bringing forth a world. But that is not going to scale to the global. It's not going to
Yeah.
go
Yeah.
to the limit, right?
This this inversion, these two versions of the 20 questions game, for
Mhm.
me, speaks pretty directly to this argument I've been having with Ben Snyder about whether Whitehead is
Uh,
a factualist or a
yeah,
processualist.
yeah,
Um, the normal version of 20 questions is more of the factualist understanding of what's true. And I think what I'm always pointing to with Ben is, yeah, but I mean, you're leaving God out of this, and that there's this everlasting macrocosmic concrescence that never achieves satisfaction. It never finishes, and so you've got, prehensions moving through phases of integration and contrast, but there's never that process never finishes, but it gradually becomes more and more determinate without ever being finally determined, right? And so,
Can I ask though why we need to invoke the quantitative assessment as though it becomes more and more? You could say there is more determinacy, but what is it that is being winnowed, that's being narrowed down such that it is becoming more determinate? I think that this is, see, the way I conceive of variation, is that it's not a thing that can be exhausted, right? It's
yeah,
just an ongoing operation. So there's nothing being. This is one of my
yeah,
objections to
it's
the
a it's a
eternal.
principle of unrest, you might say.
You might say, yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I definitely think Whitehead gets it with creativity. I mean, I think that's what it's there. Obviously, I object to the structure and I mean the structuralist aspect of the way the PNG and the primordial nature of God and the eternal objects operate. It's not that I'm not saying that there aren't, and you know this. The creativity thing is good. There's an operation that or there are operations that correspond to what the PNG does. I think that's real, and there are operations that correspond to what the EOs are. But they don't work in the way Whitehead thinks they work in my scheme, in my
Hmm.
opinion. But sorry, I keep interrupting you.
I think you have to go soon, but
Yeah.
I think we did get to the very end of the paper, so I don't think we did a terrible job. There's this part about ethics and the commons and commoning that, he's
Yeah.
getting back to what he hints at in the beginning of the paper with how, Varela really saw this not just as a scientific project, but as an ethical project. And, he's dropping some Marx citations in there, even in the footprints. So this is a really dense but comprehensive paper that I really enjoyed, and we'll get to hang out with Ezekiel in China, hopefully this summer at the International Whitehead Conference, and in our biophilosophy track, and continue to explore all of this with him. So this is a nice prequel to that.
Yeah, yeah, just want to signal really broad agreement. This was a great paper. There's so much in it. It probably would have helped with attending to more of the specific detail if I'd read it not 6 weeks ago, but I really enjoyed it. I think it's a really, really great paper, and it's very comprehensive. Like there's a whole worldview being articulated there. Lots of nitty-gritty, I could write an essay responding to lots of little details and stuff. But yeah, I think we did at least some justice to it. The ethics thing is really interesting because it would be interesting to think about that and how it interacts with Simondone's conception of ethics and the relationship between individuation and ethics. And in
Mhm.
fact, have I read this on here before? I have to read. Yeah, I think I read this to
Yep.
Darius last time I was talking to him. But like the very last paragraph of Ilfi of individuation in light of notions of form and information is I mean, there's obviously context that's leading up to this, but ethics is that through which the subject remains subject. Subject for Simondon, importantly, is individual plus milieu, right? Individual plus pre-individual, right? And the pre-individual and the milieu are related, but not exactly the same thing, but there are nuances there, right? Ethics is that through which the subject remains subject, refusing to become an absolute individual, a closed domain of reality, or
Mm.
a detached singularity. It is that through which the subject remains in an ever charged internal and external problematic, i.e., in a real present, living on the central zone of being, neither wanting to become either form nor matter. Ethics expresses the meaning of perpetuated individuation, the stability of becoming, that of the being as pre-individuated, individuating, and tending towards the continuous that reconstructs in an organized form of communication a reality as vast as the pre-individual system. Across the individual, understood as the amplificative transfer emerging from nature, societies become a world. Okay, I shouldn't have read the last two sentences because the key was the thing there. But refusing to become an absolute individual, refusing to become substance, refusing autopoiesis, actually, refusing the
Mm.
ratification of that kind of notion, refusing closure. And I think that's really important. I think that's totally consistent with what Ezekiel is saying, by the way. And I think that is what has pushed him and others away from and sort of disambiguating enactivism. Yes, we owe a lot to Autopoiesis, but this is not the same thing.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, to the extent that I understood what was going on there, it seems like no utilitarianism, no deontology. It's to me suggesting something more like a virtue ethics, uh,
Yeah, yeah,
situational, responding to the ever new situation, and not seeking some rule to apply abstractly and all across situations, nor thinking in the utilitarian sense that
yeah,
we're just all discrete individuals who, we're trying to get whatever utility function met, happiness or whatever it might be. Um,
yeah.
so I
I mean,
like that.
yeah, like it's like maintaining an availability for elicitation by the other, like maintaining an openness to the other can reach in and touch you, you know,
Yeah.
whatever that other might be.
Mm.
Um, Yeah, no,
Right.
I think it's a beautiful conception. It's what I was trying to say in my talk about the social contract and stuff. And like the if I had to go
Mm,
to some maximal primordial value, it could only be like we have to remain available. We have to remain open to ongoing individuation and not circle the wagons.
right.
Um,
Yep. Yep. There's no way to be ethical without being at risk.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Hmm.
Vulnerability, responsive. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
yeah, beautiful.
Thanks, Tim. This was
Thanks, man.
fun. Hope your next meeting goes well and look forward to maybe some shelling next. Is that where you wanted to go?
Yeah, yeah. Let me have a quick think, but yeah, within the next fortnight, we'll do another thing and maybe some shelling. Yeah.
Awesome. Look forward to it.
Cool,
Talk to you
man.
soon.
Yeah. Yep.
Bye.